Okay, this is lecture 6 for the course Europe and the United States in the 20th century. And the title of this lecture is The Reluctant Liberator, America and the Second World War in Europe. And we will start with a little cartoon, which I think sort of nicely depicts America's position in the months after the war initially broke out in Europe. We can see here the United States sitting comfortably on its nest. In the background, a number of fallen trees labelled Norway, Greece, Yugoslavia, France, Poland, England, in the process of being chipped away by a bird with a Nazi swastika. And obviously this is a sort of anti-isolationist cartoon, mocking, I suppose, the position of the United States, or the isolationist position, which seemingly believed that America could ignore what was happening in Europe at this time, blissfully unaware that they could potentially be next on the list of countries which were going to be attacked and conquered by the fascist powers. Okay, let's move on. And the first slide really just gives the events of the outbreak of the war, which I'm sure we are all familiar with. So the invasion of Poland, beginning of September. A couple of days later, France and Britain formally declaring war against Nazi Germany, fulfilling, or theoretically anyway, fulfilling their obligation to Poland. These declarations of war, though, obviously did not prevent Nazi Germany from invading and conquering Poland. In accordance with the Nazi-Soviet pact, Poland becomes partitioned between the Nazis and the Soviets. 20th of September, the Soviets intervene and take the eastern slice of Poland. Thereafter, there is little in the way of fighting in Europe for several months. You have this period which becomes known as the Phony War. I think it was a US senator or congressman who came up with this particular term to describe this state where Britain, France, formally at war with Nazi Germany, but as I say, little in the way of fighting actually taking place. Okay, this slide I will pass over again pretty quickly. You can look at it yourselves, but essentially I think there are some interesting parallels to be made between the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe in 1939 with that of the First World War in 1914. As I say there, you have two Democratic presidents, Woodrow Wilson, and 20 years later, or 25 years later, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Both of them declare a course of neutrality. Roosevelt repeatedly in the months following the outbreak of the war in Europe stressing that he was not going to be sending American forces to fight in Europe, in a similar sort of way that Wilson in 1916 campaigns on the basis that he had kept America out of the war. Another parallel that could be made is the fact that Roosevelt, again, I often get these two mixed up, well, not mixed up, but use the wrong name. Another parallel is that Roosevelt dispatches Sumner Welles of the State Department and a close sort of confidant of the president to Europe in order to ascertain the situation there. And again, you can make parallels with Colonel House during the First World War. Welles travels to Rome, Berlin, Paris, and London. Comes back deeply pessimistic, believes that a settlement is going to be, to say the least, unlikely. Finds the French pretty defeatist in their attitudes. According to Churchill's book, at least, he says the only figure that really impressed him on the Allied side is Churchill, who at this point is First Lord of the Admiralty. What's interesting about the Wells mission, I suppose, is the extent to which actually Roosevelt took this seriously. Was this simply a sop to the isolationist forces at home and a case of Roosevelt going through the motions when it came to looking for some kind of diplomatic settlement? Or was he, even at this late stage, did he even at this late stage feel that some kind of political settlement might indeed be possible? This sort of brings us back to some of the debates we had in the previous class as to the extent to which Roosevelt did actually support appeasement. Those on the appeasement side often cite the Wells mission as an indication that even after the war had broken out, Roosevelt was still seriously contemplating some kind of settlement, diplomatic settlement to the war in Europe, by making some sort of concessions to Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. Either way, it was pretty clear by beginning of 1940, spring of 1940, that a diplomatic settlement was, as I say, highly unlikely. One key difference, though, I think that is worth noting between Wilson and Roosevelt is that from the beginning, Roosevelt is clear as to which side he basically supports. So whereas Wilson in 1914 basically tries to say there is a sort of moral equivalence between Britain and France and Imperial Germany, this certainly was not the case in 1939. From the beginning, Roosevelt is clear as to which side is the aggressor and which side the United States wish to back. So although Roosevelt was clear that he was not going to go to war against the fascist powers, he was also clear as to where the United States was going to put its weight behind. He says even before the war breaks out, and again this is cited in the Churchill book, that the United States would give as much assistance as it could short of war. So from the beginning, it was clear as to which way the United States was leaning. This quotation from his so-called fireside chat. This was his weekly radio address. 3rd of September 1939, so obviously the day that Britain and France declare war. He said he could not ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. Even a neutral cannot be asked to close his mind or close his conscience. So again, an indication as to where American sympathies lay. It should also be said that public opinion in the United States was also heavily in support of Britain and France. So public opinion, although isolationism was strong, and as I say, there wasn't much enthusiasm for the idea of America going to war in 1939. Nonetheless, as I said, most Americans were pretty sympathetic towards the British and the French when the war broke out in 1939. I should say, I forgot to say this a little earlier, but when I can think about the Second World War, I tend to break it down into 3 distinct periods. So the first period, I would say, is the period of American neutrality, and that obviously lasts from the outbreak of the war through to December 1941 with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which ultimately brings the United States into the war, not only in the Pacific, but also into Europe after Nazi Germany, a day or two later, also declares war against the United States. So you have the first period, as I say, this period of neutrality, which we will discuss in some detail in a moment. The second period is when the United States is formally at war, but is undergoing a process of mobilization. So the United States has relatively few troops to commit, and so it's not that heavily involved, let's say, in the fighting. I would say that extends from the period, let's say, beginning of 1942 through to the spring of 1944. There are military actions, of course, especially in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and in the Pacific. But as I say, America is somewhat limited in its military capacity. This has certainly changed by the spring of 1944. By this time, the United States can field a pretty prodigious military apparatus. And you see the invasion of Western Europe, the liberation of France, and American, British, and other Allied forces sweeping through Western Europe. Obviously, it's worth bearing in mind that, in terms of the war in Europe, most of the fighting throughout the war is taking place in the East. So, after Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, it's very much the Eastern Front in which, the fate of the war is basically settled. To some extent, the wars in the West, particularly, I would say the North African and the Mediterranean campaigns, are basically a sideshow. When you compare the size of the military forces, in terms of the West, in terms of what is happening in the East with things like Stalingrad, the Battle of Kursk, etc. As I say, it's for all the American and the British contribution in the West is relatively small when placed in that context. Okay, coming on to this slide, as I've already mentioned, yes, the Americans are supportive of the British and the French. However, as soon as the war breaks out, the neutrality legislation, which we discussed last week, kicks into effect. So the United States is actually prohibited from selling weapons to Britain and France. Roosevelt, though, manages to persuade Congress within a week or so, fairly shortly after the war has broken out, to repeal this neutrality legislation. He persuades them that it is counterproductive. It does not allow the United States to discriminate between aggressor and non-aggressor states. So the neutrality legislation is repealed. However, Congress replaces that with legislation that stipulates that the United States can only supply weapons on a cash and carry principle. In other words, the Allies would have to pay in cash for American war equipment, munitions, and these supplies would have to be carried on Allied ships. In other words, American merchant ships would not be transporting war materials to Britain and France. The obvious reason for this, of course, is the lessons that they were drawing upon from the First World War. This idea that they did not want to see the United States drawn into the Second World War on the basis that American ships were being sunk by German U-boats. The geopolitical situation changes quite suddenly, though, obviously, in the spring of 1940, and this takes everybody by surprise. Roosevelt's strategy is essentially to try and give as much assistance as is politically feasible to the British and the French, in the expectation this is going to be a very long, drawn-out struggle in Western Europe. As I say, the geopolitical situation changes quite dramatically, though, in the spring of 1940, when Germany launches a series of spectacular offences in the West, beginning with the conquest of Scandinavia, Denmark annexed, Norway then also seized. One consequence of the campaign in Norway is that Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, is forced to resign. Churchill takes over. And it's Churchill who's in situ when, in June 1940, the Nazi Germany launches a very successful campaign in the Low Countries and northern France. And within a matter of weeks, France is forced to surrender, forced to capitulate. Again, I'm cutting a very long story short here. The main thing to say, though, is that, as I say, France surrenders and Britain is forced to withdraw from the continent. You have the so-called miracle of Dunkirk, where the British actually, against the odds, managed to extract most of their army out of France. But to all intents and purposes, this is a massive military defeat for the British. And in effect, the Nazis are now dominating Western Europe. Britain is fighting alone, and suddenly the geopolitical situation from, not just the British standpoint, but also the Americans, it looks pretty grim. And as I say, this is not something that anybody had really expected. Nobody believed that France would succumb so quickly to a German military offensive. For the British, the decision is whether or not to continue with the war. There are protracted debates in the War Cabinet. If you've seen the film Darkest Hour, which came out a year or two ago, it sort of depicts these debates, I think, relatively accurately. There were certainly forces in the British government, notably led by Lord Halifax, who believed that the British should sue for peace, come to some kind of settlement. Churchill holds out against this, believes that Britain has to fight to the end, and ultimately the Churchill's view prevails, and he gives a famous speech in the House of Commons where he basically says that Britain would fight and fight on, and if necessary, Britain would fight beyond the seas until in God's good time. Sorry, typing error, I've just noticed there. In God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old, which more or less, publicly declares Churchill's strategy that from this point onwards, the British are going to be reliant on the United States. There's a recognition that Britain cannot defeat Nazi Germany single-handedly. They are going to need a large measure of assistance from the big power across the Atlantic. The problem for Roosevelt, though, is, as ever, isolationist opinion in the United States. So although the geopolitical situation has changed quite dramatically, there is still a large slice of opinion in the United States that wants to avoid going to war in Europe at almost any cost, and is adamant or is deeply opposed to any actions which would make that scenario more likely. On the other hand, though, there's a sort of growing recognition in America that it is important that Britain, is not conquered. That if that were to happen, then this would be very, very detrimental to the security situation of the United States. And there is growing support for some form of American intervention. There is a Committee to Protect America, or Committee to Defend America, I think, which is becoming increasingly forceful in its advocacy of some form of direct intervention in support of Britain. However, as I say, there are isolationist organizations as well, deeply opposed to this idea. Roosevelt responding extremely cautiously. 1940 is a presidential election year. It was still not yet clear whether or not Roosevelt would stand for a third term in office, but he was certainly keeping his options open and reluctant to do anything that would jeopardize his electoral chances in a few months hence. The desperate situation on the part of the British, though, means that Churchill is bombarding Roosevelt with requests for material, weapons support, especially naval vessels, especially destroyers. Initially, Roosevelt is very reluctant to do much, cites congressional opinion, says it's going to be too difficult. Once, though, it's become clear that Roosevelt has secured his party's nomination to be the presidential candidate, Roosevelt becomes more flexible and finally does agree to a deal which becomes known as the Destroyers for Bases deal, where the United States agrees to supply Britain with, I forget exactly how many, but a number of fairly old, decrepit World War I vintage destroyers in return for a number of naval bases in the Western Hemisphere, which are transferred to the United States, which are leased to the United States by the British. This is an extremely good deal for the United States. As I say, the US comes out of this agreement with a large collection of very important bases. In return, as I say, it basically transfers to Britain some fairly obsolete destroyers. And in fact, it's not so much the destroyers themselves that Churchill is really keen for, but he wants the symbolic act. He wants to make it clear to the world, and perhaps also in the United States, that America was now coming down in support of Britain. So it was clearly a very unneutral act. Roosevelt agrees to this in September 1940, so he was taking a calculated risk. As I say, it was the election was still a few weeks away. Ultimately, though, Roosevelt is re-elected as president, and the issue of getting material to Britain remains acute. Yes, Britain's got the destroyers, but they're going to need a lot more of that. Churchill, as I say, bombarding Roosevelt with requests for more aid, more assistance. Ultimately, and again, I'm going to cut a very, very long story short, but ultimately, Roosevelt comes up with the idea of Lend-Lease in early in 1941, whereby he thinks of this idea that the United States would either lend or lease military equipment to Britain or any other country that was fighting against Nazi aggression. Once the war was over, then they would get it back. And Roosevelt makes, in one address, makes what I say here as a garden hose analogy. He says, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you obviously lend him you lend the neighbor your hose. You obviously don't ask to be charged for it, but you do expect it back once it has been used. And he sort of makes this analogy with sort of war materials that the United States was going to supply. One critic makes the point that military equipment is like chewing gum, that once it's been used, you don't want it back. But for some reason, this point is not really sort of picked upon in much detail. On another occasion, Roosevelt describes that the United States would become the great arsenal of democracy. Roosevelt justifies this, though, in terms of keeping America out of the war. He says, we will supply Britain with the necessary materials so that they can continue with the fight. Churchill, as well, also sort of adds to this sort of misleading view by saying, "Give us the tools and we'll finish the job." So essentially, the official justification for this is that this will keep the United States out of the war. However, of course, by 1941, it's becoming increasingly clear that it's not so much a matter of whether the United States will go to war, but when and under what particular circumstances. In the course of 1941, there are increasing discussions with the British about what sort of wartime strategy they are going to pursue. The main conclusion that they come out of this is that they will decide on a policy of Atlantic first. Obviously, the United States could well find itself fighting in both the Pacific and in Europe. Essentially, though, they say that that America's resources will be concentrated on Europe. Insofar as possible, they would attempt to postpone a showdown with Japan in the Pacific. If they were at war in both theatres, though, the Pacific would be, to some extent, a sort of holding operation, whilst, as I say, the bulk of the resources would be concentrated on defeating Germany in Europe. Roosevelt, though, is still extremely cautious, even after his re-election in 1941, is still cautious, but he takes a series of actions throughout 1941, which again are very, very unneutral. A couple of points there. United States occupying Greenland in 1941 and then Iceland. Iceland was especially important. The British had troops in Iceland up until the Americans' arrival. Essentially, the Americans' arrival essentially releases British troops to be used elsewhere. Even more significantly, by April 1941, Roosevelt orders the United States Navy to shoot on sight German U-boats west of 25 degrees longitude. And if you look on a map, 25 degrees longitude basically encompasses about 2/3 of the Atlantic. The line is slightly to the west of Iceland. So essentially declaring that a large slice of the Atlantic was going to be off limits to German U-boats. And essentially, Roosevelt initiating war against Nazi Germany, though not yet declaring it. So another crucial moment is August 1941, when Churchill and Roosevelt meet for the first time as President and Prime Minister. And they meet on two warships, HMS Prince of Wales, and I think it's the USS Missouri, I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, but yeah, two battlefields just off the coast of Canada, Placentia Bay, in August 1941, where they proclaimed the Atlantic Charter. Again, I'm going to pass over this pretty quickly, but as I said there are some similarities with Wilson's 14 points. Essentially, it outlines a series of war objectives. Even though the United States is not yet formally a belligerent, they're essentially sketching what sort of world order they want to construct after the war has come to an end. They also discuss future war strategy. Roosevelt promises Churchill that the United States would send more supplies. Churchill says, I would rather have an immediate declaration of war and no supplies for 6 months than vice versa. Should also be noted, of course, again, is that the course of the war has changed by this point quite dramatically after Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union in June 1941. So now, effectively, they have an ally in the shape of the Soviet Union. American attitudes, though, towards the Soviet Union were somewhat complicated. Again, memories of the Nazi-Soviet pact are quite fresh. You also have the Winter War against Finland, which again means that opinion towards the Soviet Union is pretty hostile, 1939, 1940. On the other hand, there's a sort of pragmatic recognition that giving material assistance to the Soviet Union, keeping the Soviets in the war, is going to be in American interests. However, this too is complicated by the fact that there are doubts about whether or not the Soviets can actually survive the onslaught. So one of the reasons for perhaps not being too forthcoming in terms of material assistance towards the Soviet Union is that there is a fear that if the United States did start sending lots and lots of guns and other stuff to the Soviets, this could ultimately fall into the hands of Nazi Germany. So as I say, support for the Soviet Union is initially quite limited. When it becomes clear by the end of 1941, beginning of 1942, that it is unlikely that the Soviets are going to succumb to the Nazi onslaught, that Hitler's gamble that he could knock out the Soviet Union in one quick blow, that had essentially failed, then the United States becomes progressively more willing to actually support the Soviets. A quotation here from Harry S. Truman, who at this point is simply a relatively obscure American senator. But I think, this statement pretty much reflects what many Americans were thinking at this time. If we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia, and if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany, and that way let them kill as many as possible. Although I don't want to see Hitler victorious under any circumstance. Okay, the period of neutrality there basically comes to an end, 7th of December 1941, with the Japanese attack against Pearl Harbor. There's all kinds of conspiracy theories and things surrounding this, but we won't go into that right now. All we need to know is that, obviously, this brings the United States into the war in the Pacific. And for a brief moment, America finds itself at war in the Pacific, but not against Europe. So for a brief moment, there are sort of doubts about whether or not America's whole strategy of Atlantic first, whether this is indeed going to be viable. In the event, though, Hitler does everybody a huge favor by declaring war against the United States. Again, there's a lot of debate about this. Was this a rash act on Hitler's part, or the rest of it? Again, we can consider this perhaps in our seminar. Either way, though, the United States suddenly finds itself at war in both the Pacific And in Europe, the British almost immediately declare war against Japan after the attack of Pearl Harbor in a sort of conspicuous display of solidarity. Japan then launches a series of spectacular offensives in East Asia, conquering, a number of territories in quick succession, which, again, I more or less said that a moment ago, so I won't repeat everything on this particular slide. With the United States, you see the construction of the Grand Alliance. And as I say, you have the Grand Alliance basically composed of three politically and ideologically very different states. So you have the Soviet Union, which is totalitarian, communist. You have the United States, the world's biggest capitalist economy. And you have Britain, which is very imperialist in its outlook. So, three countries which had obvious differences between them, and there were obvious political differences between these three. Obviously, the United States and Britain, much closer to one another than when compared with the Soviets. But even, the British and the Americans had differences, particularly over the future of the British Empire. But they are brought together because of a common need to defeat fascism. So it's military necessity, which essentially is the glue that keeps the Grand Alliance together. And one of the most striking things about the Second World War is the level of cooperation and coordination between the two Western allies, that is Britain and the United States. Almost as soon as America enters the war, Churchill pays a visit to Washington. In fact, basically invites himself to become a guest of the White House during the Christmas period, 1940 into 41. And there are a series of intense discussions about wartime strategy. One of the most concrete things that comes out of these discussions is that they decide that there will be a combined chiefs of staff, so that effectively there will be a committee composed of American and British generals who will coordinate wartime strategy. They also agree on, they can, to a large extent, I suppose, they sort of recapitulate some of the objectives that they had previously proclaimed in the Atlantic Charter. 1st of January, there is a Declaration of the United Nations, which becomes the official name of the wartime alliance, signed by Britain. I think it's signed by Roosevelt and Churchill, as well as representatives of the Chinese government and the Soviet government. Now they're at war, the main area to decide was where exactly were they going to fight, and a key division begins to open up between the Americans and the British, with essentially the Americans favouring an invasion of Northern Europe and France at the earliest opportunity. The British, in contrast, much more enthusiastic about the idea of some kind of peripheral campaign around the edges of Europe. The Soviets in particular wanted a second front in Western Europe at the earliest possible opportunity. In fact, almost as soon as Stalin finds himself at war with Nazi Germany, he is bombarding the British with requests to start sending troops to France, which obviously in 1941, summer of 1941, autumn of 1941, is a practical impossibility. Once the Americans are at war, though, again, the Soviets keep the pressure up, demanding that American and British troops be sent into Western Europe at the earliest possible opportunity. And as I say, the Americans are pretty sympathetic to this idea. However, as I say, and this is the beginning of a long debate and argument between British and American military commanders. Throughout 1941, this debate continues, but ultimately the British managed to persuade Roosevelt, to some extent, to go against his own generals. They persuade Roosevelt on the attractiveness of the idea of some kind of military campaign in North Africa. It's attractive for Roosevelt, not least because he is quite anxious that American military forces start engaging with the German army, engaging with the Wehrmacht at the earliest possible opportunity. it's sort of becoming clear that an invasion of France is not going to happen in 1942. So North Africa seems to be a more propitious area in terms of a military campaign. This leads to Operation Torch. And again, I don't want to get into too much of the details on military history here. Again, to cut a long story short, ultimately, this is a successful campaign. The Germans are cleared out of North Africa. And yeah, American forces get their first taste of fighting against the Germans, and they find that that operationally, the Germans are able to launch a fairly effective rearguard action. And after North Africa, as I say, has been cleared of German forces, Roosevelt and Churchill meet each other again, beginning of 1943 at Casablanca, where again they continue their discussion. Stalin apparently invited to attend, but he doesn't. And the British again at Casablanca, and again I'm going to pass over this quite quickly, but I might return to Casablanca in more detail in our discussion class. But essentially, the British managed to persuade Roosevelt again of the desirability of continuing with a Mediterranean campaign. Having conquered North Africa, the British said, well, the next logical step is Italy. And again, ultimately, Roosevelt is persuaded. The American generals are deeply unhappy or dissatisfied. As I say, they want to continue with, they want to prepare for an invasion of Northern Europe at the earliest possible opportunity. Casablanca also notable for the fact that Roosevelt gives a press conference where he basically, for the first time, presents this idea of unconditional surrender. In other words, the Allies would not countenance a negotiated peace with Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, or Imperial Japan. Apparently, this both surprised Churchill and Stalin. Stalin essentially says he agrees with the policy, but he didn't believe that it should be made public. There were worries that this might actually force Germany to resist even more robustly than they would have done otherwise. In 1943, then, having, as I say, conquered North Africa, they begin the invasion of Italy. Mussolini quickly sort of deposed from power, but it leads to Nazi Germany intervening in Italy, and the Allies find themselves having to claw their way up the Italian peninsula for the rest of the war. And if you ever look at the geography of Italy, one thing that's very apparent is that it's pretty hilly, mountainous, very effective, very the sort of terrain which leads itself to being able to mount a fairly effective rearguard action. Slide here on Soviet post-war aims. This sort of more or less start taking us on to the next class, the beginning of the Cold War. So I'm going to pass over this pretty quickly. But suffice to say that there are, from 42, 43, as it becomes clear that Nazi Germany is almost certainly going to be forced out of Soviet territory. There are growing concerns about Soviet ambitions in Eastern Europe once the war has come to an end. But as I said, we will get into that in more detail. Tehran, 1943, this is the first Big Three meeting. So Roosevelt, Churchill, this time joined by Stalin. And again, we might come back to Tehran in more detail because, as I say, Soviet designs in Eastern Europe do figure actually quite significantly. There is an agreement to establish a new post-war international organization. Again, Stalin presses for the establishment of a second front in Europe. Although by this time, November 1943, as I say, it's becoming clear that the Soviets have done a large part of the work in terms of forcing Nazi Germany out of the Soviet Union. But it's not until June 1944 that the Allies finally launch a cross-channel invasion and begin the liberation of Western Europe. As I say, this, in my eyes, this is the beginning of the third phase of the war, and it's significant for a number of reasons. First and foremost, by this point, the Americans are definitely the senior partner in the alliance, and this is one reason why I think the Americans have a much stronger and much more influential position by 1944. Essentially, the Americans insist by 1944 that they must now launch a cross-channel invasion, and Churchill, to some extent, is more or less overruled. Churchill still remains sort of committed, wedded to his vision of peripheral campaigns. This time, though, as I say, the Americans basically say, no, we are assembling a big force and deploying them into Western Europe. Eisenhower chosen to be the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe, although most of his subordinates were British, so there's a sort of compromise reached where an American is given the most senior job, but a large number of the second-tier military commanders were British. They decide that Normandy is going to be the Allied beachhead into the cross-channel invasion. And as we know, the Overlord operations were pretty successful. I think there's only one beach where Allied forces encounter serious German resistance. But they are then sort of bottled up on the Normandy Peninsula for about 6 weeks. So it takes them a long time to break out, much longer than they were expecting. However, once they do, the Allies make very, very rapid advances across France and the Low Countries. In fact, I think within 2 or 3 days after breaking out of Normandy, British and American forces are entering into Belgium, Brussels. So it is actually one of the most sort of spectacular, although usually forgotten, armoured breakouts of the war. Paris liberated August 1944. And actually, it's at this point many people think that the war could actually come to an end before the end of 1944. What they weren't expecting was some very stubborn resistance in terms of the march into Germany itself and German counterattacks in the Ardennes region in the winter of 44-45. Again, I've got a slide here on Western Allied relations with the Soviet Union. Suffice to say, as the war begins drawing to a close, relations between the Soviets and the Americans and the British, I should say, begin to deteriorate quite markedly. Again, there are concerns about the future of Eastern Europe. We'll talk about this in more detail. Stalin, though, deeply suspicious, now that Nazi Germany is basically on the ropes, that, its defeat is almost inevitable. Stalin, deeply concerned that some sort of agreement, some sort of deal might be reached between the Western Allies and the Germans. And that some form of anti-communist government might be formed. There is no evidence that either Churchill or Roosevelt ever took this idea seriously. But as I say, Stalin's paranoia was there until the end. The end of the war, last wartime summit held at Yalta, February 1945. So this is the second Big Three meeting. Again, this sort of brings us closer onto the beginning of the Cold War. So we'll look at Yalta in more detail in the next class. Again, though, Yalta sort of has a pretty grim reputation, especially in Poland. If you talk to Poles about Yalta, as I say, this is where Poland is effectively betrayed, according to popular accounts, popular views of this conference. Anyway, Roosevelt, despite being very, very ill, flies to the Crimea, meets with Stalin, comes up with this agreement, comes back to the United States. But Stalin becomes ever more suspicious, effectively accuses the United States of betraying the Soviet Union. And it seems there is some evidence that in the last days of his life, Roosevelt was beginning to question whether or not he could actually maintain his relationship with Stalin. But Roosevelt basically dies 12th of April, 1945. So, within a couple of weeks of the war in Europe coming to an end. Meanwhile, there's sort of divisions, strategic divisions between the British and the Americans. Churchill, having kind of held out against a cross-channel invasion, was in the last weeks of the war pressing for an allied thrust to Berlin, wanting to capture Berlin before the Russians got there. Again, he's more or less overruled by the American military commanders, who were more concerned about minimizing casualties. So Berlin and Prague were both effectively left for the Soviets to capture in April 1945. Hitler finally commits suicide, 30th of April 1945. And the war in Europe comes to a conclusion on the 7th of May 1945. To kind of sum up, I suppose, as I say, 3 distinct periods. A period of neutrality, then the United States had a policy of wanting to support Britain and France. A period where the United States enters the war, but its involvement to some extent is sort of limited, or it's sort of limited by the fact that the United States is not fully mobilized. In this period, it's the British who are sort of the senior partner in the alliance, and I think that to a large extent reflects why the British more or less get their way when it comes to deciding how the wartime strategy should be conducted in the period, 42, 43. By 44, though, America has mobilized, assembled a huge army, and its generals are more or less sort of calling the shots, and finally, a cross-channel invasion is launched, and the beginning of Western Europe. So America plays a really pivotal role during the war, in several ways, in terms of providing material assistance, but in the final stages, obviously, its military contribution is significant, particularly when it comes to the liberation of Western Europe. Should be said, though, and again, we'll come on to this in more detail in the next class, America's pays a relatively small price for the war, particularly when you compare that with the Soviet Union, which loses millions and millions of people somewhere. Nobody's quite sure, but 20, 30, maybe even 40 million people die in the Soviet Union. American casualties, in comparison, relatively light, and almost no material damage done to the United States. In fact, America comes out of the war much, much stronger in 1945 than it had been. So there's a clear contrast between America's wartime experience and that of many other countries, especially the Soviet Union, but also of other countries in Europe. We will discuss that in more detail in the next class.